Welcome to the Gladden Longevity Podcast with Dr. Jeffrey Gladden, where our passion is helping you become an age hacker. On this show, we want to help you optimize your life energy, longevity, health, and human performance with impactful and actionable information by answering 4 questions. How good can we be? How do we make 100 the new 30? How do we live well beyond 120? And how do we live young for a lifetime? I'm Steve Ryder, and Dr. Gladden, we just wrapped up with Alicia Patterson, who's a mental health counselor and women's pelvic health specialist in just up the road from me in Denver, Colorado.
Yeah. And she's a graduate of Naropa University in Boulder, which is a very, very cool school. It was a lovely conversation. I think, if you're a man and you're hearing about this, you're going to get some real insight, I think, into women. And if you're a woman listening to this, I think you're going to get some real insight into yourself, so to speak. I think both of us came away with some new information that was really, really useful and really enlightening.
Yeah, we talked about women's pelvic health. We talked about somatic therapy, and we talked about ketamine-assisted therapy and the importance of integration. And so in psychedelic experiences. And so it kind of covered the gamut with her. And for listeners, if you know someone, as you're listening to this, and you know someone that could really benefit, please share this with them.
Yeah, and she's open to talking with people around the country via telehealth. So yeah, take this in and see if this might be applicable to you or somebody that you know. So appreciate that. Welcome, everybody, to this edition of the Gladden Longevity Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jeffrey Gladden. I'm here today with Steve Ryder. Steve's back in the saddle. Steve, what's going on with you, man? It's Thanksgiving tomorrow.
It is Thanksgiving tomorrow, yeah. And what's one thing you're thankful for this year?
Wow. I'm thankful for about 1 million things. I did make a really great friend this year, though, which is always a special thing. A guy that lives in California. Yeah, okay. I was at a conference. I walked in early to this thing. He was the first presenter. I walked in and bumped into him, and we've just kind of struck up this amazingly cool conversations about stuff over time. Yeah. And he's really a talented guy. And yeah, it's kind of like, it's the kind of person that you feel like you can go a lot of places with. And I think that's such a very cool thing to find, right? Friends like that, so to speak. Yeah. So I'm thankful for that. And I'm thankful for, like I said, 1 million other things. How about you?
Yeah, I think in that same vein, being at a conference, obviously I'm thankful for 1 million things as well, like my boys and my health. But yeah, I was at a conference 2 weeks ago and I sent you a text with a couple pictures. I was with our former guests, Dr. Patrick Porter and Dr. Nathan Bryan.
And Patrick Porter.
I had a really, really, really good time. I talked a little bit with Dr. Nathan Bryan. Talking about nitric oxide. Mm-hmm. But Patrick Porter is the freaking man. I got a chance to really hang out with him a little bit and talk. And he wants to bring me on his podcast to talk about Never Alone. He's also doing a documentary about brain health. And he's like, healing from trauma and grief. You'd be a great person to bring into this documentary. And so I absolutely love the guy. Yeah, no, I know him quite well also. And he is a very cool guy. We were trading interesting stories at one point in time that we could save for another day. But yeah, he's a very, very cool guy. So that's great. That's awesome. Well, today we have another interesting person that we're delighted to make new friends with, so to speak. And she's just up the road from me in Denver.
Yeah, well, that's like, an hour and a half drive, an hour drive?
Yeah, about an hour or 15 to get to that part of Denver.
Okay. All right. You just need to drive faster. So we have with us Alicia Patterson. Alicia, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So Alicia is a mental health counselor. We'll just give you the broad strokes here. She's a mental health counselor and a women's pelvic health specialist, which is really kind of a very interesting combination. And she does a lot of different kinds of therapies to really help women optimize both those areas, which we'll get into. But, before we get into the specifics of that, I'd kind of like to understand, Alicia, how it is you got into this field. Like when you were 5 years old, did you say, I'm going to be a pelvic health specialist, or I'm going to be a mental health worker? What happened?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to share. Well, I grew up with 2 educators as parents, so I think I was kind of always predisposed to getting into public service work as my career. And when I was young, in my early 20s, I had a couple of different business jobs and was just a little unhappy and pivoted into working in healthcare. I worked for an orthopedic surgeon's office for a while. I was thinking about more traditional medical careers and applied to some. And I'm from Maryland, and it's very competitive. And then I found out about somatic psychology. I didn't get into all those medical programs. And I was like, what am I going to do? Like, I'm at this point where I really need to make a decision. And then I found out about the university that I went to out in Colorado. And they're one of the only main schools in the country that have a specialty in somatic psychology. And
okay, so which school was that?
It's Naropa University. It's a Buddhist.
Oh, I know. Wow.
Buddhist.
No, well, it's in Boulder.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Naropa, for the audience, is a really interesting school. It's the woman that I live with is actually getting a master's there right now. So I know a little bit about it from her.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a very, very interesting school, kind of a mix of Eastern, Western spirituality, psychology. Ram Dass, I think, was one of the original people that helped found the school. Is that correct? Or something like that? You probably know better than I do.
Yeah. The Naropa is a very interesting place. It was honestly a little bit of culture shock for me. I grew up like near the District of Columbia, very diverse, kind of East Coast, hard-nosed feeling, and coming out to Colorado and getting into spiritual studies and very alternative ways was so good for me and really important. So I've been in a...
So what did that do for you? What did that do for you? I'm curious. You came out there. You. It sounds like, if I'm hearing you right, you came out there really a little bit beat up, right? Mm-hmm. Not only because you worked in an orthopedics office, but because, there you are with aspirations to be helpful, difficult to get into some of the schools there, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Grew up in really hard charging East Coast. I grew up around Philadelphia. I know the East Coast pretty well. Mm-hmm. Similar kind of mentality. You get to Colorado, very different feel. Naropa, even a very different feel from Colorado, quite honestly. Mm-hmm. It's like Colorado's six standard deviations over. Mm-hmm. And so that is culture shock. So, tell us a little bit about that. What was the healing process for you that occurred there?
Yeah, I really think about and talk about subcultures. I feel like the subculture dynamic of the United States, we have so many... We're a large spanning country, and we have a lot of different things going on. And I came out here pretty young. I was 25 when I kind of made the shift, mm-hmm. and it just totally blew me apart in some very painful ways. I talk about somatic psychology, and it's all about including the experience of the body and mental health work. And I had a lot of my own stuff going on, family stuff, developmental experiences, my own relationship with anxiety, and, kind of always identified as the anxious system. And working on all of that in the classroom in Colorado was fascinating for me. I just encountered a world of tension and inflammation in my body, and being around, more permissiveness and spaciousness and more emotional intelligence than I feel like I encountered out in the DC area. It just, my mirror neurons, my brain was like, what? Like I really had a hard time adjusting for a little while. And I'm so glad that I stuck with it. And now I've had a long-term mental health practice in Colorado.
So tell me about it blowing you apart and being painful, if you're willing to go into that. That's an interesting term. I think, as we go through our own journeys, there's pain in the journey itself, but then in the transformation, in the healing process, there's pain too, right? There's a lot of pain because everything is getting jumbled up. And then there's the release of pain that goes on as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of that, if you're willing to?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I could just say my focus in women's health is so much because of my own experience. I've had such a rough journey with my cycle, my hormones, and this part of my body. And I just kind of personally had to get into it and focus on it as I was building my professionalism. So that's part of why, I just had to excavate everything. And that's what my work is all about, is really blending those two things together. So like one of my examples that I share with my clients when it's vulnerable, like sometimes I'm asking my clients to get on the floor and lay down and do movement work. It's very different than a traditional mental health setting where we're, sitting and talking and working in behavioral modalities. I have a great memory from one of my first classes where we were doing that at Naropa, and just stretching. I played pretty competitive sports as a young person for a couple decades. And I remember my teacher shaking my foot and saying, this part of our experiential is about surrender and flow and softness. And I was just rigid, and I was bawling. I was crying my eyes out. I was like, I don't even know what you're talking about. It was so jarring for me. And now this is almost 20 years later since I started like pulling this thread. Now I can find softness and I can flow, and I still have tension patterns, but it's so different than when I first started getting into this. And it is painful, it's like the more fruits and the more goodies you get, the more pain I think you kind of have to work through, and keeping that tolerable is, it's tricky. It's a delicate dance.
It is. And I think a lot of us are holding pain in our bodies, right? These tensions and things like that. We're holding pain in our body that kind of wants to be released, but sometimes the release process can be painful in and of itself.
Absolutely.
So explain for the audience a little bit this concept of somatic psychology. Is somatic psychology the idea of laying on the floor and being stretched while you're doing therapy, or what? How do you actually bring those two together?
Yeah. That's a manifestation. That's one little way that it can look or what it can mean. Somatic psychology is just inclusivity of the soma. The soma is the body, and our mind and our brain is so important, but there's been incredible steam behind this awareness of the nervous system and trauma-informed care. I think in the last 10 years, it's just skyrocketed. The Van der Kolk book, The Body Keeps the Score, everybody's just so excited about that book because what he's talking about is that our body is really metabolizing what's happening with our brain. So that's my invitation for people, is to constantly be trying to form a relationship with our body. And I loved learning that you're a cardiovascular specialist. That's your orientation, if I'm correct. And sometimes I'll just coach people into putting their hands on their rib cage and their chest and trying to sense their heart rate. Like, how's your heart doing? How's your cardiovascular rhythm? And if people can notice, like, oh, my heart rate's through the roof, or I can't feel my heartbeat at all, these are the kinds of things that I think somatic psychology can help us work with in a safe therapeutic environment where we have a whole hour to work on it together. And it, working with them.
So it seems like the somatic element here is that people are carrying, let's call it psychological trauma, in their body, and they've so normalized the experience that they're not even aware of it, right? We tend to do this as humans, is to normalize stuff. And so part of the somatic element here is getting people to actually recognize that something's kind of out of alignment. And then it seems like another element of it could be that once you become familiar with your body, in a sense, which sounds funny to say, but familiar with your body as an expression of your psychological health, then you can almost use it like an immediate feedback loop to check in and see, well, how am I doing? Well, my heart rate's going 130. I guess I'm not doing as well as I thought, right? I guess I am stressed. Or that's kind of a funny example, but you get the idea that people can feel into themselves, so to speak, and sort of see what's happening. So it's another way for them to have insight into their own psychology. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. I mean, just take the women's health piece. I do so much education and working with people who are experiencing whatever the range, the laundry list of women's health challenges is quite extensive, especially in modern societies. And talking about hormones, like, hormones are married to our mental health. Our hormonal rhythm is really talking to what are different parts of our brain and our nerve signaling. And even working with people on bladder challenges, for example, like urinary health is so connected to our stress system, and talking with people about, like, what is your experience of your urinary system and what do you know about how your bladder is signaling to your brain and the level of adrenaline that's pumping through your body? And it's so good for people to have this very supportive, non-pathologizing, questioning space. And it can be very painful. If we're living for decades with adrenaline and cortisol just dumping and pumping through our system, it takes a long time to start to heal from that. And if we just live in that for a long time, it's going to age us very quickly. And it's really hard to turn around if the longer we let it go on. So these are just baseline things that I'm trying to talk about and work on with people. And I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm curious about the emotional dynamic. I'm curious about the psychological dynamic, and trying to give people a space to make sense of things and talk about it, because sometimes they're just feeling lonely around it. And it's that's the biggest thing I've heard with women is they just feel alone and they don't really feel heard. And sometimes they'll go to their OB and their OB is like, well, this is normal and here's some birth control and we hope it gets better. And there's just this gap around women's health that I think is a huge need in our system.
So what I'm hearing is, on one hand, there's kind of a dismissiveness that occurs, and people end up feeling isolated and alone and kind of hopeless because of that being dismissed. And then another one that you said was this non-pathologizing, which for the audience, pathology, of course, is, when something's ill, so to speak, but not labeling. What I'm getting at is, it sounds like you're not labeling people as having pathology. You're basically saying, hey, let's just look at kind of where you are, and you're okay, but let's see where you are and let's see how we get you back into kind of an optimized place. But even that's kind of a healing process when people don't have to walk out of an office and say, oh, I've got a problem, I've got a disease, I've got a diagnosis, I've got a CPT code, right? So am I on track there? Is that part of it too?
Absolutely. Yeah, I really feel like, and that I feel is part of my own healing process too. I feel like the structure of more, I don't want to say traditional, but like where I grew up in the DC area, for example, I feel like is very elite in a lot of ways, very sophisticated. It's the second most educated state in the country to be in Maryland. And there's this pathologizing feeling about being there. I mean, for so long as a young person, I would walk out of appointments and I'd be like, I had this narrative of I'm fucked up. And what do you do with that? It's like, that's not inspiring to someone to want to try. And I also don't want to bypass people and say, oh, well, this is all in your head or it's emotional. And so I'm really trying to be not pathology, but not bypass, and just be with people and say, let's be curious about this. And that is so novel for most people, which is really sad to me. How effective.
It's really a beautiful space, right? To go from being either dismissed to where you feel isolated and completely alone, or being pathologized to where now I have a diagnosis, I have a problem, I have an issue, I have a disease. And now you're also alone in a way. Now you're also isolated, into a much more sort of welcoming. The somatic element here is kind of welcoming the whole person, is kind of what I'm hearing. Bring all of it, right? All of it is welcome here, and let us work through it and figure out how we, optimize this for you. It's kind of a beautiful approach, it sounds like.
I feel that way. I've benefited so much from it in my life. I've been through extensive therapies and counseling and my own pelvic floor work and working through all these kind of traumatic layers of what my body was holding, my nervous system, my blood flow, my immune system. I mean, it's wild for me. I really love lineage work and looking at our families and where we come from, and something that I'm really processing right now. When I look at my grandparents, there's so much intense illness and they died pretty young. And like, I've been able to turn around my own illness things, but it has taken so much money and work. Like, it is profound for me. I'm like, this is like about $100,000 to like turn around what my nervous system was doing. And it's so beautiful to have access to it. And so many people don't have the resources or the availability or the dedication inside of themselves to want to do that. And it's brutal and it's so rewarding. And it just, for me, it's the only way to work. Like, I don't benefit from talk therapy anymore. I have to digest things through my body for it to be effective for me.
Very cool.
This episode of the Gladden Longevity Podcast is brought to you by H2 Molecular Hydrogen in the Gladden Longevity store.
Yeah, Steve, you've heard us talk about this numerous times on the podcast in terms of the benefits of H2 and hydrogen water. We love it. It's really the best way to balance your entire redox system. So it really protects you from free radical damage. I take it every time I get on a flight to protect me from radiation damage when I'm flying. And I use it to rejuvenate my brain in the afternoon. There's really two kinds of exercise. There's physical exercise, and taking H2 before or after that works great. But also there's mental exercise. And I find that the H2 will bring your brain back when you're tired in the afternoon. So I think it's like the perfect thing for longevity and for performance, quite honestly.
And I talked to you about this, that I found dropping 1 or 2 tablets in a glass of water right before bed. I've seen an overall bump in my deep sleep when I do so. And
fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you click on the store tab when you visit GladdenLongevityShop.com and use the promo code podcast10, you'll get 10% off your order. And this code isn't only good for our H2 product, but it's also good for all the supplements we carry. So podcast10 at the GladdenLongevityShop.com.
Yeah, one of the other things that I use it for routinely is when I'm about to go on a mountain bike ride. And I will say this, that if I go on a long mountain bike ride, I will take one prior, I'll take one during, and I'll take one after. And some of the Ironmen that we've worked with have said that when they're doing an Ironman, they'll take it 3 or 4 times throughout the race. And their comment is that it's like taking out the old battery and putting in a new one. It really rejuvenates your body's ability to perform when you're doing more extended athletic activity. So think about that too. If you want to go do a longer hike or whatever else, take it with you.
So GladdenLongevityShop.com, enter podcast 10 for 10% off your order.
H2 molecular hydrogen. It's low-hanging fruit on your quest to make 100 the new 30. So there are probably a lot of people out there listening to this that may be resonating with what you're saying, where talk therapy in and of itself, it can be helpful to some extent, but it's not really getting it done, so to speak. And so what you're talking about is another avenue in through this somatic therapy that allows for transformation to occur. I'm curious about 2 things. One is you invested, let's say the price of an education to kind of get to where you are, right? And money well spent. I'm sure you don't regret that. I wonder if there was a more direct line now, as you look back, was there a more direct line from being where you started to where you are today? And knowing what you know now, could you have chartered a different course that would have been $30,000 or $50,000 or something other than $100,000? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of funny to watch myself over the years, because I feel like what I have this mental health practice. I really believe in it. I love working with people. I love including the body. And sometimes there's just a little something. And in terms of investment, I feel like my personality, I really do resonate with my roots more and more as I get older. It's kind of a funny thing with me. I was like, I'm out of DC, I gotta go. And now that I'm getting older, I'm missing it and longing. And so my next training that I really want to do is a human cadaver, elongated dissection class. I know this amazing anatomist who's very spiritual about it, but he works with lots of surgeons. And, I'm like, why do I want that? I'll tell people about, this is what I want to do next. And they're looking at me like, you're nuts. You want to pay thousands of dollars to go spend time with a deceased human body. So I do kind of wonder about the medical side of things, and if there would be a way for me to be a very holistic OB or something. Sometimes I feel that, but at this point, I'm committed to the mental health side of things, and that's probably where I'm going to stay, just considering the investment in the school.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, having done anatomy and having dissected a cadaver for an entire semester and kind of learned the body inside and out that way, which I don't remember everything I learned, of course, but you learn and retain so much of it in another sense. It is fascinating to see, what people carry in their bodies, whether it's in their joints or in their tendons or their abdomen or their organs. You see life's effects and where they're carried in the body that way, in a way that's really difficult to understand otherwise. And there's tremendous respect that you have actually for the human life, right? There's a sense of gratitude that this person is allowing you to actually learn from them. So, if you want to do that, I would encourage you to do that. You won't be disappointed. You will come away with more insights than you've ever probably thought you would get from it. So it's very, very cool stuff. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about was this concentration on the pelvic floor. I'm getting the sense that you had mentioned some things about your own menstrual cycles and some things like this, that this was probably a piece of your story as well. But talk to us about the pelvic floor, because this is actually a big issue for a lot of women, childbirth, not childbirth, lots of different things that can go on, various traumas, etc. Can you just kind of outline for the audience a little bit about the pelvic floor and how you visualize it from the standpoint of the psychological trauma that it holds, the anatomy that it has, and how you kind of go about helping people?
Sure. Yeah, that's my opinion after, I added this to my work about 7 years ago, and I've been pulling this thread for myself and my own health for many more years than that. And I feel like it's the deepest rabbit hole that somebody can go down if they have, we all have pelvic muscles, so it's not just a women's health need, it's part of all human beings. And the intricacies and the complexities of the female reproductive system are quite striking. So I always have this memory of my first therapist. I, worked a lot around my cycle and what to do. And I was having a lot of pain and kind of debilitating every single month. And I've worked myself into, I'm in such a good place with it now. And all the things that I had to do nutritionally and working with my organs and trying to regulate my hormones and working on some developmental misses in my life, the neurobiology of how the endocrine system develops when we're in that developmental time. I went through some hard things when I was a teenager, and I just felt like it kind of disrupted my development a little bit.
Tell us about that. I'm sure the audience would find that interesting to hear about. I don't know exactly what, I understand what you're talking about, but I don't understand what you're referring to. Maybe if you don't mind, maybe you could share that with us, because that sounds really fascinating.
Yeah. So, one big thing is my parents got divorced when I was in 12 to 14. Okay. There was a really big change in my family home life. And if you know the ACE score list, that's the trauma list of what children are exposed to. And I don't have anything on that list that's really significant for me, except having parents that are divorced. So I think that was really shocking to my system, and it changed my flow and going between houses and, really missing my dad, and my dad moved out, and my relationship with my mom. The female relationship, daughter-mother, is one of the most, it's so wild when people start to pull that thread. It's our infancy, it's our childhood, it's our epigenetic information that's encoded into our cells. And my family, my grandparents, there's so much trauma from war and immigration. And so I started to just open up to that, and it really was very disturbing to me and very dysregulating. It was kind of this psychological, and there's mental illness in my grandmother's history. And I kind of saw myself, I was I don't want to go down that road. So I need to.
What was her mental illness, if I can ask?
Oh gosh, majorly tied in with addiction. Any substance that she could get her hands on, she was just up and down, and barbiturates and pills and alcohol, just you name it. So she had a lot of health challenges and a lot of mental difficulties. And because of her early childhood trauma, for me, she had sexual trauma that was never addressed, and it just sculpted the whole way her life went. And that is so sad to me. So I started pointing myself in the direction of, I have to get grounded. I've got to get into my body. And that's what led me to the somatic journey. And then that's what led me to the pelvic journey. And I found this woman. I didn't even know that pelvic floor therapy was a thing. I had never heard of it. I didn't know what these muscles were. I didn't really understand my body, even though I had worked in this medical office. There's very little talk about pelvic health, mostly mainstream. There is more now, which is good, but still not enough. And so I knew this woman from my dance community, and I said, I don't even know, but I'm curious. And we had this conversation, and I was like, I feel like I need to process some stuff through my body that I've talked about a lot, and I just don't want to talk about it anymore. So, my first experience of sexuality and my first partner that I had, and falling in love and going through a breakup, and my cycle, my experience of my cycle and my cramps and my very intense PMS was one of my main drivers for wanting to address my physiology.
Let me just interrupt you for a quick second, because it's a really interesting statement that you said about processing. I wanted to start processing some things through my body as opposed to kind of intellectualizing them, I suppose, right?
Right.
So that's an interesting thing. I don't know if everybody people can relate to that, but what does that mean to process it through your body? What mindset did you go into to process it through your body? I'm curious about that.
Yeah. It means, like, if I could I really love the nervous system. I prefer to focus on the nervous system if I'm going to choose one thing. And I just did this nerve class, and he confirmed for me that our nerves are running through everything, like everything in our body.
Everything.
So, for example, when I worked with this woman, and pelvic floor therapy is internal muscles, it's intravaginal, it's working with the inside of the body. It is so different than working on top of the skin. It's like a whole different universe. What you said about dissection and like learning and understanding, having contact on the inside of the body. That's not a transaction. It's not a medical exam. It's not a sexual experience. It's just slow, connected, kind touch, and listening to those nerve currents, like feeling my nerves against her hand was profound for me. And those nerves had things to say and feelings, and it really surprised me how emotional it was for me. And it didn't make sense to me. It was just grief and anger and shame and like all these hard things that were ready to move down. And I felt that. I felt my muscles release down. And then when I learned that our pelvic muscles pull up and in when we're afraid and we're protecting ourselves and we're kind of pulling away, I was like, oh, well, I think I've been doing that for my whole life. So releasing those muscles downward was really profound for me.
Yeah. Okay. So this is interesting. So the audience knows that I kind of believe that everything is related to the nervous system. And I'll give you a hint. If you're going to take your anatomy course and there's going to be an exam, the way to study for it, the way I did so well on the final, was I basically just tracked all the nerves through the body. And if I could know everything they touch, then I would know anatomy. And that's pretty much what it boiled down to. But in this particular situation, what you're saying now is working through your body is, rather than what you feel in your head or feel or can think about in your mind, you're actually going to allow your nervous system to speak to you through different areas of your body, right? How the nerves are, what they feel like when they're being massaged or whatever, right? And so that's a really interesting thing. I don't know if anybody's, I suppose there's an analogy there for people that have gotten a good massage, let's say, where, they're holding tension in their shoulders or in their whatever hips or whatever, and somebody really works into that, and all of a sudden you feel that there's all this tension there. So it's kind of working through the body to get to that piece, and then emotions, of course, can be connected to it. So, yeah, okay, I'm getting the idea. That's cool.
Yeah, and everything, our pelvis is loaded with endocrine tissues, immune pathways, blood flow, muscles. I mean, it's this little bowl. It's this like network at the bottom of our body. And the woman I did my pelvic floor training with, she's a PT who worked in the hospital system for many decades. And she was really struggling with it. And she was one of the first PTs in her little area in the northwest of the country that said, this is emotional. We have to acknowledge that this is emotional for these patients. And she says the pelvis is the storage house. It's like whatever's happening in the rest of our body is going to kind of sequence down and be held in this bottom tissue. And it can become very stagnant or heavy or like, prolapse. Like people's organs are just sinking down. And if they don't have tone in their tissues, it's not a good thing.
Right.
Or they have rigidity and they have pain. And so many people suffer with this without talking about it. They're just, alone and thinking this is just how it is to be in this body, and it doesn't have to be true.
Right. And I know that your specialty is really working with women, but if you're a man and you're listening to this conversation, I mean, men have a pelvic floor too. Absolutely. And there can certainly be pelvic floor issues for men based on trauma, either psychological, sexual, physical trauma, things like that. So really there's an analogy there for both sexes. Interesting.
Yes, men, absolutely. Men have pelvic pain. Men have all types of challenges. I think sometimes it can even be more challenging for men because there's not this entryway to work with the muscles in the same way that there is with the vaginal canal. Like a lot of pelvic muscle work with male bodies is rectal, and there's just not as much access in the same way. And male bodies have a prostate, and the prostate is important. It's it's different than the uterus. Some people talk about like the prostate is kind of similar to the uterus, but prostate cancer is pretty slow growing. And so I think people kind of don't pay attention to it, but it still is a tissue that needs care. And no matter what body and parts we have, our pelvis is holding a lot for us.
Yeah. And it's also, to your point, it's kind of a hidden muscle group with all the other connections that go into it. So, it's fascinating. So the people that you attract into your practice, do they come with a wide variety of issues, or do they mostly come to you with specifically pelvic things that are bothering them, or how does that play out for you?
Yeah, there's a big range. There's definitely people with symptoms or diagnoses that are wanting specific support around something. Like I said earlier, there's so many different pain syndromes and like strange, mysterious, we don't know what to call it. So we're calling it vulvodynia. And that's, a certain type of pelvic pain experience. Right. And infertility challenges. I have a couple of clients right now who are going through IVF treatments and trying to have children. And so there's this like very specific thing that they want to work on, they need support with, they want feedback, whatever. There's also people that have traumatic histories. They want to address that. Sometimes those groups go together. A lot of times people that have symptoms that are very problematic do have a trauma history. And then sometimes it's just people who are curious and feel disconnected and they feel that they're missing something. Part of them feels totally unavailable. They feel kind of dead inside. They don't know what to do. And they feel like they want to receive support to look at it. And that's a really wide range of patients and clients and what their needs are.
So do you end up working with other professionals, maybe like physical therapists and things like that? Before we started the show, you were talking about that a little bit with men. Is that also true with women, where you would kind of work together on somebody like that?
Absolutely. I think continuity of care is important and helpful, especially when people have a more acute, kind of severe thing going on. Like, being a counselor is a very wild experience. The trauma stories that I've heard are shocking, and like it makes me go like, that can't be true. Like that's a very painful part of humanity. So if someone has a really severe thing going on, I really want them to have a treatment team. I feel like if I'm the only one supporting them, it's just not really going to work. So I love collaborating with prescribers and PTs and body workers, and I refer people all the time. Like, if all you do is work on this when you're here with me, it's not going to go very far for you. And there's problems with access, like having access to high-level practitioners is so expensive and it's hard. So there's some real like class issues with access to this level of support.
Yeah. Very, very cool. Now, it seems like it takes, one of the downfalls of the medical system, let's call it, is all the siloed elements of it, right? And I think breaking down all those silos, not only in your own training, which covers many, many areas of psychology, but also, across disciplines, quote unquote disciplines, to really get people what it is they need and would benefit from is really kind of the key thing. Steve, what are you thinking about as you hear about all this?
Oh, this is great stuff. I mean, somatic therapy is something that's been popping up in my life over the last year. And I went to a counselor up in Golden and did a little bit of ketamine work with him and did a little bit of somatic work in dealing with the death of my wife. But Alicia, I got a question for you. On your Instagram profile, you talk about ketamine-assisted therapy as well as psychedelic integration, doing that work. So talk about how you have seen, because we've talked about here on the podcast on episode 165, we talked with a clinic in Texas that they work with Texas patients. But for people that could be interested in ketamine therapy, how do you work with people? And then really talk about the importance of integration.
Yeah, the psychedelic renaissance is absolutely happening, especially in Colorado. The MAPS conference, the huge government-funded organization, had their conference here this year. And my take is people are experimenting. People are getting their hands on psychedelic medicines. There's a very wide range of what that means. And I want to be a person who can support as long as people are being safe and responsible and intentional. I really like offering a space where people can talk about their experience and not be judged as like, you're doing drugs and you need to stop doing drugs. And that's what I grew up around on the East Coast, is this very kind of like rigid mentality around it. And there's abuse. There's definitely abuse happening around psychedelics, and there are substances, they alter your system. So I'm like cautious, but also want to be supportive of people. And I have done some ketamine therapy with clients, and I think ketamine is a great way to access a psychedelic state. It's one of the only legal options, and it's a commitment. You really have to commit to working with a prescriber and make sure that it's a good idea for you. But it can be very powerful for people sometimes, and it's regulated, it's one of the like controlled, available experiences. And I think ketamine, my take on ketamine, I did it for myself for like a little course of treatment because I wanted to see what it would be like. I feel like it's like a fancy, expensive mood stabilizer. Like, it doesn't have all of the hard side effects that most of the psychiatric medications do. And it's not covered by insurance, and it's not super available to everybody. So I think some of those issues are popping up in the psychedelic world. It's like, well, if this is only available to a pretty small percentage of people that are able to shell out thousands of dollars for the medicine and the prescriber and the therapist, it's a really cool thing. And there are some issues with psychedelic therapy that are showing up that I think are important to talk about.
So would you be part of a psychedelic treatment team where you might be involved with the preparation for somebody going into the actual experience, and then be that person that helps them integrate it, or part of the team that helps them integrate it on the back end? Because it seems like that integration, there are people out there doing ketamine on the street, right? To go for that state of whatever. I've never done it myself, but then you've got, and I have done some other things, but it seems like to really get the therapeutic benefit, and I've been around people that have gone through, 6 ketamine sessions and had really good people supporting them before, during, and after, and gotten profound results from it. But I think my sense of it is that it takes a group of people really supporting that process for somebody to really get all of the benefits from it that they can get.
I agree.
Sounds like that's kind of what you're thinking as well.
I agree with that. Yeah, I think that the company that I worked with, they said that, and maybe this is because this is their model, you know, we all have our own interests, so I'm aware of that, but a lot of the research shows that if you are engaging in a therapeutic process and you're setting goals and you have intentions and you're really tracking what the experience is and behavior change and mood change, then that's what people benefit from the most. And if people are just, you know, at home in their bed popping this medicine, it's not going to go very far in terms of therapeutic progress. So, and there is abuse, you know, people party with ketamine, which I really don't understand, because I'm like, it's a very like dissociative kind of anesthetic, relaxing experience. And people, they want that and they need that. And there's different ways to orient toward ketamine treatment that I think are really interesting. Like some people will prescribe a nasal spray and just, it's like almost like a micro dose, just a little bit every day. Other people will do the sublingual tab, which is kind of mid-range, and then others will do the IV, which is more like the heavy-duty dosages. And they're all really different, and I think it's really cool, and it can absolutely bring incredible benefits for people. And it's a modality, you know, it's not like a miracle, like fix my life. It's not like I'm going to go do this one time and everything is going to change. I think sometimes there's that type of expectation with psychedelics. And it's like, it actually just shows you more of what you feel and gives you an experience of less barriers to processing those emotions. So having adequate support and longevity and a healing relationship that is sustainable, I think, is the most important part of any psychedelic therapy.
Steve, I see you nodding your head there. It sounds like this is part of your experience as well.
Without question.
Yeah.
Yes, without question. That's definitely been. And I've seen it with friends too. I've seen very much exactly what you've been talking about, Alicia, the ones that go in with intention and then they come out and they work on what they saw. The other ones that are just doing it just to see what happens and la-di-da, they keep going back.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, I applaud your approach to this. I think, you know, you've really taken it and run with it, so to speak, and continue to expand out into, you know, really being a healer, if you will, and trying to potentiate healing for people and helping them optimize. And, you know, in this podcast, one of the reasons we think this is so critical is because getting these parts of your life optimized are so critical for the rest of your health, whether it's your blood pressure, your heart, whether you have a stroke, your cholesterol, everything, your eating disorder, everything else. So much of it revolves around this, which ultimately, you know, gets translated into your longevity, your ability to live young for a lifetime, which is really what we're all about. So it all makes a lot of sense to us. So I just want to thank you for coming on the show. It's really been a lovely conversation.
Thank
really
you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you both so much.
Alicia, how do people get in contact with you?
My website is probably the best place for like all the information. I am on Instagram, but a lot of it is like, here's my cat. You know, I'm not like super active with social media. I've turned away from it a little bit. If people really want to be in touch with me, joining my email list, I share more on my email. I'm a little more personal. And I welcome outreach. You know, every time I do these shows, I hear from people like, I'm struggling with this and thank you for talking about it. You know, if people want to be in touch with me, I welcome it. And I just want to encourage people, like, if you have the availability to get support, lean into it. And, you know, I've spent so much time and money and energy getting support for myself. And that is why I am where I am today. And access to support is an issue, like I said. So.
And what is that website? It's
AliciaNPatterson.com. The middle initial is N as in Nicole.
And Alicia is spelled ALICIA.
Correct.
And Patterson.com. And of course, for listeners, link will be in the show notes.
And Alicia, do you do telehealth also? I mean, you're in Colorado. If this is a international broadcast on this podcast, if people want to reach out to you, Do you have the ability to talk to people via sort of a telehealth connection, or do they have to meet you in Colorado, or how's that work?
Yeah, I welcome telehealth. I have my mental health licensed, more contained counseling practice, but I also have a women's health, I don't want to call it coaching, whatever, consultation. I welcome outreach from people. Mm-hmm. I talk with people all over the country. There's so many people, especially in the South, that have zero, like not one practitioner around them. So if anybody wants to talk and they're in a dry zone around this, I welcome outreach.
Beautiful. Okay. Appreciate that.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Gladden Longevity Podcast. If you would like more information on what we've discussed or other topics, please reference the show notes or go to gladdenlongevitypodcast.com. You can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter by searching Gladden Longevity. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to get future episodes delivered to you and share our podcast or this episode with someone in your life that you may find benefit. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with another exciting episode. The Gladden Longevity Podcast is provided for informational purposes only. It does not constitute medical advice. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of a physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. The use of any information and materials linked to this podcast is at the listener's own risk.